Greece gave the world Alexander, the man who conquered the largest empire anyone had ever seen before he turned 30. Greece gave the world the Phalanx, a wall of 18-foot spears that had been unbeatable in open battle for 200 years. Greece gave the world democracy, philosophy, the Olympic Games, and arguably the entire idea of the West. So how did a republic of farmers and part-time soldiers from central Italy, a people the Greeks initially considered barely civilized, conquer the people who had invented conquest itself? Not with a bigger phalanx, not with better philosophy, not even, in most individual battles, with obviously superior soldiers. Rome won with disunity it didn't even have to create. Alliances it collected patiently, one old grudge at a time. A navy the Greeks never took seriously until it had already boxed them in. A propaganda stunt so effective that entire cities voted to worship the man behind it. And a military machine specifically built to adapt the moment the old way of fighting stopped working. This is the story of how all 5 of those ingredients came together over 70 years, and why almost nobody in the Greek world saw the ending coming until it had already happened. Here's the part most people skip entirely. Greece was never really one country for Rome to conquer. There was no single throne to seize, no single army to break, no single surrender that would have ended it. When Alexander the Great died suddenly in Babylon in 323 BC, at only 32 years old, his empire didn't pass to an heir capable of holding it together. It passed straight into chaos. His own generals, men who had marched with him from Greece to the edge of India, turned on each other almost immediately, in a brutal, decades-long series of conflicts historians now call the Wars of the Successors. Within about 40 years, the largest empire the world had ever seen had shattered into permanently rival kingdoms. The Antigonid dynasty ruling Macedon and much of Greece, the Seleucid Empire sprawling from Anatolia to the edge of India, and the Ptolemaic kingdom controlling Egypt from Alexandria. These were not cousins keeping an uneasy peace. They fought each other constantly, for generation after generation, over the scraps of Alexander's legacy, while dozens of individual Greek city-states and regional leagues fought their own smaller, older wars underneath that larger chaos. By the time Rome ever set foot in Greek affairs, the Greek world wasn't a united front waiting to repel an outsider. It was a room full of ancient rivals who happened to share a language, a religion, and a deep, practiced mutual distrust that ran far deeper than any suspicion they held. Rome's opening move into that world didn't even look like the start of a conquest. It started with a coastline and a map. Directly across the Adriatic Sea from Italy's eastern shore sat Illyria, a stretch of coast Rome had already come to think of as its own strategic backyard after 2 earlier wars there. Macedon's ambitious king Philip V had his eye on that same coastline. In 214 BC, with Rome fighting for its very survival against Hannibal's invasion during the Second Punic War, Philip saw his opening and made a fateful decision. He allied openly with Hannibal against Rome, betting that a Roman republic on the brink of collapse in Italy would have nothing left to spare for a war in Greece. He was almost right. Rome, unable to send a field army east while Hannibal was still burning its own countryside, reached instead for the one tool it did have available: its navy. A Roman fleet moved to blockade the Adriatic, bottling up Philip's coastal ambitions and cutting his lines to Hannibal without ever having to risk a single legion on Greek soil. This conflict, remembered today as the First Macedonian War, sputtered on for 8 years and formally ended in 205 BC with a treaty that resolved almost nothing on paper. But Rome had quietly learned 2 lessons that would define the next 70 years. Naval power alone could contain a land empire it wasn't yet ready to fight directly, and Philip of Macedon could never again be trusted. Rome remembered exactly who he had sided with when it mattered most. The real war came next, and this time Rome didn't fight it alone. In 200 BC, with Hannibal finally defeated and Carthage neutralized, Rome crossed into Greece again, this time with a full invasion force, and this time exhausted Greek states that had spent years living under Philip's increasingly heavy-handed regional dominance, especially the powerful Aetolian League of central Greece, actively switched sides and joined the Roman war effort. This is Rome's alliance strategy working exactly as designed. Rome didn't need to personally conquer thousands of Greek soldiers because those soldiers volunteered to fight fellow Greeks on Rome's behalf, simply because Philip had spent decades making more enemies among his own neighbors than Rome had ever made among strangers. In 197 BC, the two main armies finally collided at a modest ridge in Thessaly called Cynoscephalae, the Dog's Heads, named for its twin rocky summits. On flat, open ground, Philip's phalanx was arguably the finest infantry weapon on earth, an unbroken wall of 18-foot sarissa pikes that no line of infantry could survive walking directly into. But the ground at Cynoscephalae that morning was rough, broken, and hidden under a low, drifting mist, and a wall of spears that long needs genuinely flat, uninterrupted ground to hold its shape. Small gaps began opening as individual phalangites stumbled on loose rock and uneven footing they never trained for. The Roman legion, unlike the phalanx, didn't fight as a single, rigid mass at all. It fought in small, independently maneuvering units called maniples, each capable of pivoting, wheeling, and driving straight through exactly the kind of broken terrain that paralyzed a phalanx formation. One unnamed Roman military tribune, acting entirely on his own initiative and without waiting for orders from above, spotted an opening on the exposed Macedonian right flank and swung his own maniples around to strike the phalanx from behind. The formation that had terrified the known world for 2 full centuries broke apart in a single afternoon. Roughly 8,000 Macedonian soldiers were killed and another 5,000 captured. Philip himself barely escaped north with the shattered remnant of his army. Then came the Masterstroke, and it wasn't a battle at all, it was theatre. In 196 BC, at the Isthmian Games near Corinth, one of the 4 great Pan-Hellenic festivals that drew spectators from every corner of the Greek world, in front of a stadium packed with Greece's most powerful and influential people, a Roman herald stepped forward and, on Rome's explicit orders, announced that every Greek city was now free. No occupying garrisons, no tribute payments, fully self-governed under each city's own ancient laws. According to the historian Plutarch, the roar from the crowd was so sudden and overwhelming that birds circling above the stadium reportedly startled and scattered into the sky. People didn't just cheer, they rushed the field. They mobbed the Roman general responsible, Titus Quinctius Flamininus, a young commander fluent in Greek who had spent years deliberately cultivating exactly this reputation as a Phil-Hellene. Several Greek cities went even further, voting to formally worship him as a living god and striking commemorative coins bearing his face. In one single afternoon, Rome had won the single most contested, most prestigious region in the entire Mediterranean world, without formally annexing a single city or leaving behind a single permanent garrison. It hadn't needed to occupy Greece by force. It had simply convinced Greece to thank it, publicly, in front of the entire Greek-speaking world, at the exact moment and place guaranteed to spread the story fastest. For roughly the next generation, Rome ruled the Greek world through influence rather than occupation. And for a while, it genuinely worked. Rome didn't need soldiers stationed in every city when it had grateful, indebted allies running every government instead. But that same uneasy peace drew Rome into one final major confrontation with a Hellenistic superpower. In 192 BC, the Seleucid king Antiochus III, ruler of a vast empire stretching from Anatolia toward India, marched into Greece, gambling that the very Greeks Rome had just liberated from Macedon might now rally against Rome's presence instead. They didn't. Flamininus's years of careful investment in Greek goodwill held firm. Roman legions and their Greek allies crushed Antiochus's forces at Thermopylae, the same narrow mountain pass where 300 Spartans had once made their legendary last stand against Persia, and then finished the Seleucid threat decisively 2 years later at the Battle of Magnesia in Asia Minor in 190 BC. With that single campaign, Every remaining Hellenistic power large enough to plausibly challenge Roman dominance in the eastern Mediterranean had now been humbled within the span of one generation. But old kingdoms and old grudges rarely stay buried for long. Philip's son and successor, Perseus, inherited a Macedonian throne stripped of its former power and spent years quietly rebuilding it from the inside, restoring the kingdom's finances, rebuilding its army, and carefully renewing old alliances with other Greek states who still resented living under Rome's shadow. Rome watched a potential threat rebuild itself in real time and, just as it had with his father decades earlier, chose to move first rather than wait. In 168 BC, the two armies met again, this time near the Macedonian coastal town of Pydna. It was almost an exact rerun of Cynoscephalae, one generation later. Once again, the Phalanx surged forward with genuinely terrifying initial force across broken, hilly terrain. Once again, it simply couldn't hold its shape once the advance outran its own internal cohesion. The Roman commander, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, later admitted that the sight of that advancing wall of spears was the single most frightening thing he had witnessed in his entire military career, right up until the moment it visibly began coming apart at the seams. Roman legionaries poured directly into the widening gaps, splitting the once unified phalanx into small, isolated pockets of men who could no longer support or protect each other. In under an hour, one of history's most feared military formations had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Perseus fled the field, was captured soon after, and was dragged back to Rome in iron chains to be publicly paraded through the streets as the centerpiece of Paulus's triumph. The Macedonian monarchy, an unbroken royal line stretching back centuries before Alexander was even born, simply ceased to exist. Rome carved the conquered kingdom into four small, deliberately weak republics, explicitly forbidden by Roman law from intermarrying or even trading freely with one another, specifically so the pieces could never quietly reunite into a threat again. It took less than 20 years for even that careful arrangement to collapse. In 150 BC, a man calling himself Philip and claiming to be Perseus's long-lost son raised a rebellion and briefly succeeded in reuniting Macedonia under his own self-declared crown. Rome crushed the revolt within 2 years, and this time stopped pretending client kingdoms and puppet republics were a sustainable long-term solution at all. In 146 BC, Macedonia was formally converted into a direct Roman province, governed by a Roman magistrate and permanently garrisoned by Roman troops. There would be no more useful fictions of independence. That same catastrophic year, Rome finished the job in the south of Greece as well. The Achaean League, a federation of city-states spread across the Peloponnese, had been one of Rome's most loyal Greek allies for decades, one of the very alliances Rome had spent generations carefully cultivating. But with Macedon now permanently gone and no remaining counterweight left to fear, the League's leadership grew increasingly bold, forcibly absorbed Sparta against explicit Roman objections, and began openly defying Roman ambassadors sent specifically to rein the League back in. After nearly 70 years of patient, calculated restraint, Rome's patience finally ran out completely. The war that followed lasted barely a few months. Roman legions under the consul Lucius Mummius crushed the Achaean army just outside Corinth, one of the single wealthiest and most strategically vital cities anywhere in the Greek world, sitting directly on the narrow isthmus that connected northern Greece to the Peloponnese and controlled trade routes between two separate seas. The Roman Senate then made a decision deliberately intended as a message to every city anywhere that might ever consider open defiance again. Corinth was not simply defeated in the ordinary sense. It was burned to the ground in its entirety. Its famous bronze statues and artwork were shipped back to Rome by the wagon load. Its entire surviving population was rounded up and sold into slavery. In the very same year, Carthage was simultaneously being destroyed on the other side of the Mediterranean in North Africa, meaning two of the ancient world's oldest and proudest rival civilizations were annihilated within months of one another, sending an unmistakable message about exactly what defying Rome now cost. Mainland Greece, birthplace of democracy, philosophy, the Olympic Games, and the Phalanx itself, was now, in every practical sense, Roman territory. And here is the twist that Rome itself never fully saw coming. The Roman poet Horace summed up the entire irony in a single famous line written roughly a century later. Captive Greece took her savage conqueror captive. Roman senators began learning Greek as an essential mark of sophistication and status. Roman temples borrowed Greek columns, proportions, and architectural vocabulary almost wholesale. Roman sculpture copied Greek originals so closely and so extensively that museums today still struggle to definitively tell some of them apart. Roman philosophy was, in enormous part, simply Greek philosophy translated into Latin and given new Roman names and Roman authors. Educated Roman families increasingly sent their own sons to study in Athens, in much the same way modern elites send their children abroad for a prestigious university education. Rome had won every single battle that ultimately mattered, across 70 uninterrupted years of intermittent warfare, and it still somehow ended up building the intellectual, artistic, and philosophical core of its own emerging civilization directly on top of the culture it had just conquered, and, in Corinth's case, quite literally burned to the ground. So, in the end, how did Rome actually conquer Greece? Not by being meaningfully smarter than the Greeks, and not in any single individual battle by being obviously or overwhelmingly stronger. It conquered a room full of ancient rivals who had genuinely never stopped fighting each other long enough to notice a common threat approaching. It used naval power to contain enemies it wasn't yet ready or willing to fight directly on land. It bought decades of loyalty with a single, perfectly staged act of public generosity at a sports festival that the entire Greek world was already watching. And it ground down every remaining independent Hellenistic kingdom one broken hillside at a time, across 3 full generations of patient, deliberate, unglamorous warfare. And when the fighting was finally, permanently over, the only thing Greece ever truly managed to conquer in return was everything that came after. Rome conquered Greece's cities, its armies, and its independence. Greece, in the end, quietly conquered Rome's entire mind.